So after applying a systemic process to identify students for tier two, like it was just reviewed, the next step is to start to group students by common needs, like common behavioral function or common skill gap needs. This is very similar to how some reading interventions approach small group instruction to the deficient area of reading that affects overall reading or reading comprehension. For example, decoding or fluency. When we talk about doing systemic problem analysis and grouping students, we're looking to do what's called standard protocol problem analysis. So what is linked here gives you some illustration of the levels of problem analysis in the four-step problem solving process. What differentiates each is the amount of additional data a team would need to ensure a high probability match between what a student needs and what the school has to offer in terms of interventions to support them. Sometimes, like the middle option, students' needs aren't quite as clear or easy to classify, and we may need more information to classify their needs. But we attempt to have a existing intervention option that can match their needs and even be adapted to match the needs that are identified. On the right-hand side, the most complex option of problem analysis is that we see often in our tier 3 interventions and problem solving. That intense analysis that requires individualized functional behavioral analysis that leads to an individualized behavior intervention plan. Here in yellow, this is what we're encouraging you to use as a systemic tier 2 approach. Standard protocol is going to require little to no additional analysis because you're going to use the data that you've used in systemic identification to identify those common needs by function or skill needs. And we're matching them to ready to use pre-planned evidence-based interventions that we're reviewing in the last section. So again, we encourage you as teams focus on that simplest option that's in yellow and try as much as possible to stick to standard protocol where we match ready to go interventions to common group needs and function. Simply put, now that we have all this data that we identified students by, we're going to use that data to determine the types of support students need. Those student supports will already be available on our campuses in terms of evidence-based interventions. And we're going to use data to group students so that they can be matched pretty quickly or fluidly as a tier 2 system. When we say to group by common needs, here's a set of guiding questions we often encourage teams to think about. You're really looking for what are the barriers to those students demonstrating the school-wide expectations and rules as a tier 1 curriculum and a tier 1 expectation. That's also assumed that those are what are taught on the campus and are reinforced and acknowledged. So simply, do we look for students who have similar instructional needs, similar functions? Do we have students who are seeking to get or get away for something? Or do they have similar groups that we could address through, for example, a social emotional skill curriculum? Last question is one we already use in academic skill needs, but how we group them just by the same needs that they need, for example, the reading example that I said earlier, by those reading skill gaps that we need. So why do we look at function in tier 2? And like I said, with the standard protocol going really light in the amount of data, we shouldn't be collecting too much data, but looking for themes in the existing data that identified students. And we do that because we know interventions that are matched to function are going to be much more effective than those that don't consider function for behavior. Even though we know behavior occurs pretty repeatedly to serve a purpose, the same problem behavior can serve many different functions for students. So for example, we know when kids are having a disruptive behavior in class, it could be to gain peer attention, like having their peers laugh, or it could be to avoid a non-preferred task. I'm being disruptive because I don't want to do writing tasks. I don't feel like I'm good at writing. If we try to use the same intervention for multiple types of functions, we often won't have the same level of effectiveness than if we really assign them based on function or make adaptations to certain interventions based on the function of the problem behavior. And like we said in the last slide, we don't want to look for an intensive functional behavior analysis or assessment at this point, but we do want to look to themes and that identifying data that's going to help us know what some of the functions are, the problem behaviors that led them to the tier 2 intervention. And as a little joke, because this is probably me in school, very similar to if the rule is we're going to raise our hand, but you never acknowledge that hand raise. We usually get faces like that from our class peers. We really do want to think about what is the behaviors that tier 1 expectations rules and what we want to see. If they're being referred for tier 2, they're being referred for problem behaviors, and we want to think about what their functions of those problem behaviors are and also what skill gaps they may have. So a quick note on function, and remember looking for themes and identifying data. So we show this slide in our tier 1 training as well, but when we look at function, we're keeping it simple. And we use the visual on the left to do that you may want to share with staff. We're looking for either to get or obtain one of the 3 boxes in the middle or to avoid or escape one of those boxes in the middle. So if you look at the pictures on the right-hand side with the cat, the escape, they're avoiding or escaping your attention. The little kitty is crawling in the sink because he doesn't want your attention or is hiding from you. We have students who do a lot of problem behaviors because they want to escape your attention or your demands, or they want to escape maybe peer attention because they get uncomfortable being around peers or adults. And then the little kitty is probably meowing very loudly in that picture. We're looking for attention. They're trying to obtain that attention, whether that's an adult or peer. If you think of students in your classroom, this is a very common problem behavior function. I'm doing it just to get the attention of my friends or to get the attention, maybe inappropriately so, of an adult. At the bottom, it could also be to get or obtain a thing, an activity that I want, a center that I want, something that I want that I can't have. So I'm doing a lot of inappropriate things to try to get that. And then last is the one we commonly forget sometimes, but that sensory piece. So our behavior problems occurring at a certain time when a sensory piece is something I want to get away from. For example, cafeterias are very loud. So maybe problem behaviors are occurring a lot during lunch. Or if we have minors or discipline referrals, they've occurred during that lunchtime where we're having a lot of loud voices or noises. It could also be to get or obtain a sensory. So maybe we're seeing a lot of problem behaviors through some of our referral data, like the teacher request for assistance or our office discipline referrals that are coming during periods of the day that are after long chunks of sitting. Maybe it's after long types of whole group or during a time where I've had to sit and do a lot of independent work. So the sensory is I need some movement. I'm doing a lot of inappropriate behavior because I want to get around and move, or I'm trying to create my own sensory stimulation because I've been having to sit or be without interaction for a very long time. So we want you to think of this simplistically at tier 2 again. I can't say that enough. And keep it very minimal, not an individual functional behavior assessment, but looking for trends in the referring data. Academic deficits, looking at when ODRs are occurring with those academic deficits and seeing if maybe escape or avoidance is being paired with really academic deficits in a certain area, for example. A lot of schools or teams minor forms in PBIS will include some perceived motivation or kind of what was the location, what was the time. So when you have multiple minors or multiple referrals, even on referral forms, you can use that pattern in multiple referrals to look for that trend to help identify function. And if there's ever cases that don't follow too easily to a theme, it is okay to gather a little more information, like a quick questionnaire or a quick observation. But in most cases, just looking for that trend in the referring data should work in terms of guessing that function. Last note on interventions, when you group by common needs, we keep talking about escape or avoidance for many reasons, or for skill gaps. So when we think of internalizing interventions, we often like to look at this visual around the cognitive model for internalizing and how those interventions work. When you look at the example about a situation happening, some thought comes in, I have a certain emotion with that thought, and then that results in behavior. So when we start looking at internalizing, we're usually looking at things around thoughts or emotions. We maybe are able to observe some of that emotion or that reaction to behavior, but we're looking to dig into some of those precursors, or if you think of it behaviorally, there's antecedents that's happening prior to the behavior to intervene on. So when you look at some social skill groups and some social emotional skill groups or cognitive behavior small groups, they're also intervening on those thoughts for an individual. So when I have those thoughts or emotions, I know some strategy I can work on to prevent that problem behavior from happening, resulting in a more desired behavior. So in this quick example, in a classroom, if students are constantly put in small groups or asked to do interactive, collaborative grouping structures, they might start noticing some kids withdrawing or not participating in those. And in this particular example, a student could think that kids are smarter, that they perceive enormous much self-esteem in their smartness. And I don't want to embarrass myself, so I'm not interacting. That thought is what's causing the lack of interaction. That's the behavior that the teacher observes. When we start working on the student with those self-esteem issues, we can have the student rate their level of worry of working with others, and we should see that level of worry go down. So just thinking of two different types of ways that we look at interventions. One is that function. We're also going to be working on skill gaps, whether that's social skills that I maybe haven't been taught or practiced, or something as deep as this for internalizing is working on when I have certain thoughts or I have certain emotions. How can I react myself differently to that in certain situations? And those group curriculums will teach me a appropriate reactions. They'll provide practice opportunities with that. So we're going to be looking at both types of interventions as part of our Tier 2 support. So as far as grouping, one example here, all in words, and then we'll look at a quick visual example, is that, and this was taken from some of our friends out of Illinois, is that when we group students by common needs, it ends up being little buckets like this. So in this particular one, we had 3 groups among the students who were referred for Tier 2 concerns. They fell in 3 main needs. One being pro-social skills. So you can think of that like skills we need that are replacements for avoidance, withdrawal, attention seeking. So that really could be any function, but it's going to be targeted at certain skill gaps that the groups need. So sometimes we'll have 2 pro-social skill groups focused on escape or avoidance or attention seeking. Those are even groups that you think of like anxiety and coping skills. Those are all groups that we're using to replace skills that we're using for escape and avoidance. The other 2 groups that you see, problem-solving skills. If we're seeing a lot of aggression or fighting on campuses, which is very common, or just really quick to horseplay and be more physically aggressive, we might teach kids skills to help with anger management or certain emotional management so that we don't result in more physical aggression, but we result in more strategies to replace those skills that prevent the aggression. And last but not least, which is really common on campuses, just that supplemental instruction in academic and behavior skills is something all campuses need, but in their 3 buckets of needs, that's how they group them. Things like reteaching and supplemental instruction of the rules, routines that exemplify our expectations. And sometimes these get a little targeted, especially in our secondary, like our middle school group, to be more study and organizational or self-management skill types of groups. So just a quick example, when they end with the 25 students referred, they had 3 different intervention groups on their campus. Your groups or buckets may not have the exact titles on them. We'll talk about that a little bit with curriculums and what you use. But the idea is well illustrated here that they took the total amount of kids referred for Tier 2 and were able to put them in readily available groups. And to take that example one step further, and those of you who are visual and not verbal folks, this is an example of that visually. So we want natural groupings. So if we have 3 groups like we did in the last slide, and my secondary people, I apologize, it's a little more elementary and visual, but you could put some secondary students in there as well. When we look for those natural groupings, if it's an academic or supplemental instruction, it'd be really easy to deliver that academic behavior supplemental instruction with a check-in, check-out program. That's an evidence-based intervention we'll talk about in the next module. Similar to the next group is that pro-social group. You could actually address that group depending on the needs with the check-in, check-out or a social skill instructional group curriculum. And again, we'll talk about some options of that in the next module. It can also be a little bit of a combination of that. Our check-in, check-out gets taken a little bit step further, and we provide some of that social emotional skill in the check-in or the check-out. So we're matching the groups then with ready-to-go interventions. And on the bottom, you have the last group as far as problem-solving skills. Same thing. We can use some of those social emotional learning curriculums that are evidence-based to teach replacement skills for that we will again talk about in the last one. So the idea here is the grouping takes you to, you wouldn't need more than 2 or 3 interventions on a campus to cover this. And some of these could be adjusted further to where you only have 2 of your evidence-based interventions on the campus to address many different needs. And that's that idea of standard protocol, is we have these natural groupings that then can be matched very well to some evidence-based choices. And again, it doesn't have to be more than that 2 or 3 of those really good ones that can match several functions or skill needs. And we'll talk more about that in the last one. So you had the visual example or the word example of the groupings from the last slide. And this is just a little visual of how those groups would then be matched to a couple interventions. And then we always will have students that have many needs. So it's this idea of prioritizing and integrate. So sometimes, and I mentioned that in the theme of function, when we look at who's identified for Tier 2 support, we're also going to look at that overlap between academic and behavioral needs. If we see kids who are having a high level of academic deficit, we know we're working on building some academic skills. They may start to have behaviors in the meantime because of frustration or trying to escape or avoid some of those tasks. So it doesn't mean we have to provide a totally different supplemental intervention, but we might integrate some behavioral strategies within their academic skill deficit interventions that are already occurring. So for example, 2 groups here, math interventions group that if students are working on those math deficit skills, they may have a lot of frustration or may want to get out of some of that work. So we could integrate some strategies in there like a way for them to indicate when they're getting frustrated, how frustrated are they, when do they need a break? Or a first then, we complete a couple problems, we take a break, and then we're able to do something preferred. Some of those little behavioral strategies that aren't a whole nother group or a whole nother intervention, but just are part of their math group instructional intervention. And then the reading group, same thing. We might just try utilizing some break cards to break up some of the longer tasks, or if they're getting overwhelmed with a task, let them take an appropriate break for a certain amount. During that break, they can also do things like breathing, drawing, moving around. That helps self-regulate us or handle frustration, gets us refocused and ready to try again a really hard task that we might have to as part of our reading instructional group. So there's a plethora of little strategies you could build in there. We just gave you a couple examples, but the key here is that it doesn't have to be a whole different intervention if academic deficits are our first and most prioritized need. So that takes us to the end of this section, and we will have you move on to the team activities where you'll have a chance to practice with your team with several options. Some of the concepts we talked about in identifying and grouping.